All right, so let's talk about our first loop, the for loop. If you've never seen for loops before, buckle up. The syntax is a little bit odd the first time you see it, but you'll use it so often that eventually it just makes sense. So this is a representation of the syntax, sort of the pattern. I know it looks like a lot, it looks very confusing, but let's take it step by step. So a for loop is very similar to a conditional, not in the way that it works, but in the syntax. We have a conditional statement here. We have if, and then something in parens, and then a block of code enclosed by curly braces. And whatever code I put in here will only run if this condition is true. This code is associated with that if. When we write a for loop, it's the same pattern. We have for, which is the keyword. It has to be for, not uppercase for, not F-O-U-R. It needs to be F-O-R. And then we have parens, and we'll talk about what goes in there in just a moment. And then we have curly braces, a code block, and whatever content is in here will run every time this loop repeats. So if I loop 10 times, this code is going to run 10 times. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce that. So what is the syntax? What goes in here? It's a little tricky to explain. There are 3 separate pieces. A lot of times people come to JavaScript, or students who come from other languages ask, is there an easy way to just run something 10 times no matter what? Some languages do have a really easy way to say, make this happen 10 times. Let's say I have console.log. I want to console.log hello 10 times. Without a loop, the obvious way is to do this, and that sucks. And I think I'm only at 9 times, but there we go, 10 times. But this is obviously horrendous. And this is only 10 times we're running something, but there are many situations. If we have an array of 10,000 items or even 1,000 items, each one is different. If we had to write it by hand to print out each item in the array, that would be a nightmare. We would do something like console.log array of 0, and then manually array of 1 and array of 2. If we have even just 100, my fingers are going to fall off by the time I finish typing that out. So we use loops, but a for loop is not as easy as saying, make this happen 10 times or 20 times. There are 3 separate pieces. The main idea behind a for loop is that we define a variable. And this variable is like a counter. It's a counter for that loop, and we start it at some value. If I want to run something 10 times, I'll just do 10 total times. I could start a variable at 0, at 1. I could start it at 50. It doesn't really matter where it starts, at least in this case. And then I define a stopping point. So if I went from 50, I'm going to go upwards. I'll say we'll stop when we hit 60. That would give me 10 iterations. And then the third step is what happens to this variable each time through. So if we're trying to run 10 times, I would say add 1 to the variable 10 different times. So there are 3 pieces: the initial value, when to run the loop, and then how to change value each time. This kind of looks like gibberish here, so let's revisit our slide. We have for, and then in parens, we will define a variable. Let's say it starts at 0. Then we'll say a condition, and this condition is something like, while that variable is less than 10, run this loop. And then we increment that variable by 1 or by 2 or by -5. It's up to us. So here's a simple example. We're going to define a variable in this loop. That's the first piece, the initial value for a variable. Usually people will use the variable name I because it's short and it doesn't have to mean very much. I think originally maybe it stood for index or integer. It doesn't matter, but you'll see people use I, J, K. You can name this whatever you want. It's just a variable you're making. Let's have it start. Let's go with 1. We'll have it start at 1, and then we need a semicolon. Then we have a second piece, which tells JavaScript when this loop should continue running for. So we're going to run as long as I is less than or equal to 10. As soon as we're past 10, it should stop. And then we tell it how to update I each time through the loop. It's pretty standard to do I++ because a lot of the time you want to loop 1 number at a time. 1, and then 2, and then 3, and then 4. But you could also do +=3. This would loop by 3s. So we would start with 1, and then we add 3, so we get 4. And then we add 3, and we'd have 7. Then we add 3, and we hit 10. And then if you did it again, we would get 13, at which point we're past this, so it no longer runs. But let's just add 1 each time using that nice shortcut, ++. And we could start by simply console.logging hello 10 times. I'm going to refresh my code over here. Oh, so annoying that the Chrome console does this. It collects all those 10 identical console.logs and displays them as 1 with the number 10 next to it. So it did print out 10 times, it's just hard to see. So why don't we also print out I? So I'll just do hello colon and then the variable I, which is our loop variable. I'll refresh the page, and there we go. So to step through this one more time, so make variable I, start it at 1, keep looping if I is less than or equal to 10, and then add 1 to I each time through. So I started at 1, that's less than 10, so we're going to console.log I, which gives us hello 1, which is what we see here. And then I is incremented. So I becomes 2 because we did ++. Is I still less than or equal to 10? Yes, it is. So we console.log 2, so that's printed out. Now I is going to be added 1, or have 1 added to it again, so we get 3. This keeps going until I is 9, at which case we're still in the clear. We add 1, I becomes 10. This is still true because we have less than or equal to 10, so that's fine. But then we print out hello 10, after which I is incremented to 11, and then this is no longer true. I is not less than or equal to 10. 11 is greater than 10, so we are done with the loop. So this loop is going to run 10 times because of the way I set it up. But if I instead said I starts at 5, it only runs 5 times, or 6, I can't do math, because we're including 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If I instead did I equals 1, but instead of I++, I did plus equals 3. I'll duplicate this so we have a record of the original. I'm now going to increment by 3. Refresh the page, and this is what we get. 4 total times that it ran, and the value of I was 1, 4, 7, and then 10. Afterwards it became 13, and the loop stopped. So if you feel comfortable with the syntax at this point, go ahead and move on. We have more to talk about with for loops in the next couple videos, but if you want some more practice, I'll do a few more examples. Let's generate the first 20 perfect squares. Now a perfect square is just a number times itself. So the first one is 1 times 1, then we have 2 times 2, we have 3 times 3, which is 9, 4 times 4, 16, all the way up until 20 times 20. So to print those out, I would need to loop from 1 to 20, and then console.log each number times itself. So to loop from 1 to 20, we need to initialize a variable at 1, and we could name it anything. Like I said, I is very, very standard, but just to prove it, that it doesn't matter, let's go with num. So we'll start at 1, num is 1. We'll continue while num is less than or equal to 20, or alternatively, less than 21. I like to do it this way. If I know I want to include 20, I like to put less than or equals instead of this. I don't know why. It's an extra character. Other people prefer it the other way around, but I'll do it this way. And each time through, we will add 1 to num. So let's make sure we're generating the correct numbers by just console.logging each num. Okay, 1 to 20. Now we want to print the perfect square instead, which is num times num. And I think I'm actually going to do a little string template literal so that I print something out like 4 times 4 equals 16. So I will interpolate here and display num, and then x for multiplication, and then interpolate again with a $sign, display num again. Let's just see what we get now. 1 times 1, 20 times 20, and then I'm going to add my equal sign, and then interpolate one more time with a $sign, and do my actual math, num times num. Refresh the page. Awesome. 1 times 1 is 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, all the way up to 400. So this is looping in one direction. We're going from a low number up to a higher number. I'll also show that we can go the opposite direction. So here's a loop where I starts at 50, and we subtract 10 each time, and we continue looping as long as I is greater than or equal to 0, so as long as it's positive or 0. So 50 We subtract 10, next time is 40, then 30, then 20, then 10, then 0, then we're done. So this is counting backwards, and you can definitely do that. We'll do one more example of that. Let's comment this one out. Let's count down from 200 and count down in intervals of 25. So 200, 175, 150, 125, 100. So we'll go back to using I because that is the standard term, unless we have nested loops, in which case you'll see we use other letters like J and K. We're not going to start at 0. We'll start at 200 if that's what we're going to do. We'll loop while I is greater than or equal to 0, so not less than. We definitely want greater than. If we have I starting at 200 and we're saying run this loop while I is less than 0, it's never going to run because 200 is already greater than 0. So if I tried that, each time through we will subtract 25. Let's see what we get. Console.log, does it work? Refresh the page. We don't get anything. And that's because we wrote our loop in such a way that it's never true. I begins at 200, and this is checked. Is 200 less than or equal to 0? Nope. So nothing happens. We just move on to the next line. So if I put this line down here, after the loop, we would see that it is the only thing to run, or the only thing to print out. So what I wanted to do was go from 200 down to 0. So I want to go while I is greater than or equal to 0. I want to stop when I becomes negative. And we'll subtract 25 each time. Remember, this is a shorthand way of saying I equals I minus 25. It's easier just to do minus equals 25. Let's try it, and instead of saying does it work, let's just print out I. And there we go. 200, 175, 150, all the way down until we hit 0, which is the last thing we print out, the last I, at which point I is 0, we subtract 25, which gives us negative 25. This is now false, and we no longer print anything out, and the code moves on, and this runs instead. So when we do have a loop like we have here, this code is going to keep running over and over and over until the loop is false, this condition is false, and then whatever happens afterwards will run. Okay. So for loops are a lot, I know. They're always a little tricky to teach to people who have never coded before. Unfortunately, there's not many moving pieces, but the syntax is kind of ugly. Just remember the 3 pieces. Your variable that you're using for the loop, usually called I, you give it some initial value. Then the next part after semicolon is the condition that checks if the loop should continue running. So the loop will run as long as this is true. And then another semicolon, and then whatever operation you're performing on I. Usually adding or subtracting, but you could also multiply, you could divide, you can do anything there, but most of the time we're doing simple math, and 99% of the stuff I do at least is adding 1. It's really, really common that you just want to add 1 to something, as we'll see when we work with arrays and strings in just a video or two. Okay, that's a lot, I know. Hopefully you're still there. Good job.